Why did Russia invade Ukraine in 2022? It's a question that has dominated headlines, but the real answers are far more complex than a simple news report can cover. Most of what we hear boils down to a few sound bites, but the story behind this conflict is decades, even centuries in the old. To truly understand why this war began, we need to peel back the layers of history, geopolitics, and deep-seated fears that have shaped the relationship between these two nations. So today, we're not just looking at the events of 2022. We are going on a journey through time to uncover the hidden drivers of this devastating war. We'll explore the strategic calculations, the historical grievances, and the clashing ambitions that led us to this point. This isn't about taking sides. It's about seeking understanding. If you want to know the real story behind the war in Ukraine, stay with me. Let's start by rewinding the clock to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. It's a moment of triumph for the West, but for Russia, it's what President Putin would later call the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Imagine a massive empire suddenly splintering into 15 independent countries. Ukraine, with its deep historical and cultural ties to Russia, declares its independence. This was a pivotal moment. For many Russians, Ukraine wasn't just another country. It was the cradle of their civilization, the heartland of Kievan Ruses. Its independence felt like a phantom limb, an amputation from the body of the Russian world. This sense of loss is crucial. It's a historical wound that has festered for 30 years. While Ukraine looked westward, dreaming of European integration and a democratic future, Russia watched with growing anxiety, viewing its neighbor's pivot as a betrayal and a direct threat to its own identity and security. Now let's talk about the big elephant in the room, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. After the Cold War, NATO began to expand eastward, absorbing former Soviet bloc countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. From the Western perspective, this was a natural progression. These nations were sovereign, and they chose to join a defensive alliance for their own security. But from Moscow's viewpoint, it looked like a relentless encirclement. They saw a military alliance, originally created to counter the Soviet Union, creeping closer and closer to Russia's borders. Promises were allegedly made in the 1990s that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. While the existence and nature of these assurances are heavily debated, the perception in Russia was one of betrayal. Each wave of NATO expansion amplified Russian fears. They saw it as the West taking advantage of their post-Soviet weakness. When talk began about Ukraine and Georgia potentially joining NATO, it crossed a red line for the Kremlin. For them, a NATO-aligned Ukraine with Western military bases on its soil was an existential threat they could not tolerate. This brings us to the first major escalation, 2014. That year, Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted by a popular uprising known as the Maidan Revolution. He had just rejected a major trade deal with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia, sparking massive protests. To the West, this was a democratic revolution, the Ukrainian people choosing their own destiny. To Russia, it was a Western-backed coup designed to install a hostile government on its doorstep. Russia's response was swift and decisive. They annexed the Crimean Peninsula, home to a majority ethnic Russian population, and, critically, the historic base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Kremlin justified this as protecting ethnic Russians and righting a historical wrong, as Crimea had been transferred to Ukraine during the Soviet era. Simultaneously, a pro-Russian separatist movement erupted in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, sparking a low-intensity war that would simmer for the next 8 years, claiming over 14,000 lives. These events set the stage for the full-scale invasion. The conflict in the Donbass became a frozen, yet bleeding wound, and the Minsk agreements, which were meant to bring peace, ultimately failed to resolve the underlying political deadlock. So, what changed between 2014 and 2022? Why did Russia decide a full-scale invasion was necessary? Several factors were at play. First, Ukraine's military was getting stronger. With training and equipment from Western countries, the Ukrainian army was becoming a much more formidable force than it was in 2014. From Russia's perspective, the window of opportunity to act was closing. Second, Ukraine's society was becoming more unified and more anti-Russian. The annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass had the opposite of the intended effect. It solidified Ukrainian national identity and pushed the country firmly toward the West. Third, there's the energy factor. Ukraine is a key transit country for Russian gas flowing to Europe. As Europe sought to diversify its energy sources and Ukraine pushed for greater energy independence, Russia's leverage was diminishing. Controlling key infrastructure and energy routes in Ukraine would give Moscow immense power over Europe's energy security. For example, Ukraine discovered significant natural gas reserves in the Black Sea and in its eastern regions. Gaining control over these areas wasn't just about territory, it was about controlling vast energy wealth and denying it to a pro-Western Ukraine. We also have to consider the personal vision of Vladimir Putin. To understand the decision to invade, we have to look at his writings and speeches, particularly his 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In it, he laid out his belief that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, artificially divided by outside forces. He sees modern Ukraine as an anti-Russian project, a historical anomaly created by Soviet leaders. This isn't just political rhetoric, it's a deeply held conviction that the West has stolen a core part of Russia's historical and spiritual world. In his view, a Western-aligned, democratic and successful Ukraine on his border serves as a dangerous alternative model for Russians, threatening the stability of his own regime. The invasion, from this perspective, was a desperate, high-stakes gamble to reverse this trend, to forcibly bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence, and to redraw the security map of Europe in a way that he believes corrects the mistakes of the past. It was an attempt to stop history from moving in a direction he found unacceptable. Let's also look at the immediate trigger for the 2022 invasion. In the months leading up to it, Russia amassed over 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders while insisting it had no plans to invade. They issued a list of security demands to the United States and NATO. The core demands were a legally binding guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO and that the alliance would pull back its forces from Eastern Europe. These were non-starters for the West, which operates on an open-door policy, meaning sovereign nations are free to choose their own alliances. When these demands were rejected, the Kremlin declared that diplomacy had failed. On February 24, 2022, Putin announced a special military operation. The stated goals were the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. The demilitarization part is clear. Russia wanted to dismantle Ukraine's military capacity. The denazification claim, however, has been widely condemned as baseless propaganda, an attempt to delegitimize Ukraine's government, led by a Jewish president, by falsely painting it as a neo-Nazi regime. This narrative was designed to rally support within Russia by invoking the memory of World War II, a conflict central to modern Russian identity. So, where does this leave us? The invasion of Ukraine wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of 30 years of post-Soviet history, driven by a complex mix of factors. There's Russia's deep-seated sense of historical grievance and loss after the collapse of the USSR. There's the strategic fear of NATO expansion, which Moscow views as an existential threat to its security and influence. There's the battle for resources, particularly energy, and the control of strategic territory like Crimea and the Donbass. And finally, there's the ideological and personal vision of Vladimir Putin, who sees this as a historic mission to restore Russia's greatness and correct what he views as the injustices of history. Understanding these interconnected causes doesn't mean justifying the invasion, but it is essential if we want to comprehend why this war happened and what it might take to one day end it. This conflict is not just about two countries, it's a clash of civilizations, a struggle between competing visions for the future of Europe and the world order. It's a tragic story with deep roots, and its consequences will continue to shape our world for decades to come. Thank you for watching. It's a complex and sensitive topic, and getting to the truth requires looking beyond the headlines. If you found this breakdown helpful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events shaping our world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay curious, and see you in the next one.